Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning into my video. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging my co-presenters and by saying that, like the other two papers on this virtual panel, I'll be talking about what the social scientists call urban informality. But unlike the other two papers, which focus on the French context, I'll be looking at two West African cities, Abidjan and Dakar. And following the theme of this conference and the lead of Pierre Nora, I'll be focusing on the affective, identitarian aspects of mémoire, which Nora opposes to histoire, grand H, with its claims to objectivity and authority. And rather than framing my Lieu de mémoire in national or even nationalistic terms, as Nora tends to do, I'll be discussing the phenomenon of urban informality as more of a transnational phenomenon with global ramifications. So what does it mean to talk about urban informality in this broader sense as a site of memory? What's being memorialized, and what might memorialization teach us about post-colonial cities more generally? It's questions like these that brought me to the three works I'll be discussing today. Let me bring these up. And since this is an image heavy presentation, let me turn off the video of myself so I don't block the slides. So I'll be looking at Jean Rouch's Moi en Noir, which is a cinema vérité documentary shot in Abidjan's Treichville district. And then Ousmane Sembène's first film, Borom Saret, which examines a day in the life of a poor cart driver in Dakar. And then Mambéty's La Petite Vendeuse de Soleil, which is dedicated to the street children of Dakar. Now, taken together, these films offer a kind of time-lapse image of the West African city, from the waning days of imperial domination in Rouch to the early years of independence in Sembène to the era of structural adjustment, austerity in Mambéty. These films also share a significant number of formal and aesthetic features, beginning with the fact that all three of them present the city itself as a kind of co-protagonist. And this is made clear in many ways, but is immediately apparent from the way in which all three of these films are shot, with plenty of panoramic views of the city and camera angles and focal depths that take care to situate their human protagonists deep within the urban landscape, where what is going on in the background is often as interesting and significant as the foregrounded action. And in Rouch's film, this co-protagonist setup is made perfectly explicit, as the protagonist, Oumarou Gandara, is immediately associated with the Treichville neighborhood as a kind of tour guide. Rouch also takes care to give us a bit of Treichville's history, and even shows us a map of Treichville. And more generally, he is quite frank about the miserable living conditions that prevail there. And we see here a kind of proto-Fanonian protest against the racial and economic divisions of the city. Above all, Rouch and Gandara give many examples of the daily hustle that Gandara and his friends must engage in to survive at the margins of the informal economy, including this search for jobs at the port. And from an ethnographic perspective, what makes the film so interesting is Rouch's decision to make Gandara the central voice of the film, enabling him to take control, at least partially, of the film's narrative, which helps to decenter the objectifying colonial gaze typical of more traditional ethnographic studies. And this is what the Nouvelle Vague cineasts loved about this film. And what emerges from the stories of Gandara and his buddies who have migrated to Abidjan from rural Niger is the story of their struggles to negotiate the transition into urban modernity. And this is something that Rouch strongly emphasizes in one of his more extended ethnographic commentaries, which we can see here. And I won't read this passage, but let me draw your attention to the last two sentences, which are bolded, where we see that despite his apparent sympathy and affection for his subject and his progressive political sympathies, Rouch adopts a spontaneously colonial perspective, taking for granted the necessity of adapting to a modern world defined in colonial extractivist terms, and treating all signs that Gondara and his friends are unprepared for that world as a kind of sickness, a maladie. In particular, their attachment to traditional belief systems is treated as a sign of backwardness that's no less harmful than their taste for boxing, booze, Hollywood, gangsters, and other American vices. And whatever reservations we might have about Rouch's assessment of their condition, and to be clear, I have quite a few, the film does a great job of capturing the central role that city life plays as a symbolic and material site of conflict between traditional values and the exigencies of modern life, and also the extent to which urban informality acts as a kind of buffer zone where tensions between rural and urban modes of existence get worked out. And on this topic, Sambén's Borom Saret makes an interesting point of comparison. Now, Sambén's film is structured around a day in the life of a poor cart driver as he struggles unsuccessfully to bring home enough money to feed his family. And as the film opens, we see that his home is organized like a traditional West African compound around a shared courtyard where we see his wife working in the background. But as the camera follows him into the street, it becomes clear that we are in an urban setting, probably one of the purpose-built quartiers populaires of Dakar, like Medina, Koloban, or Grand Dakar, which did indeed keep many of the features of the cœur or courtyard-based concept of traditional rural dwellings. And there are a number of scenes that highlight the transitional nature of urban informality, including changing building materials and notably an encounter with a griot. This encounter is the high point of the cart driver's day, reminding him of his glorious ancestral past, but it also winds up costing him his day's earnings. And this is something he will come to regret by the end of the film. And then there is his disastrous foray into the Plateau district, the former European quarter, where pre-modern contraptions like his horse-drawn cart are not allowed. And this scene ends with the confiscation of his cart by the policemen, highlighting the tensions between the new post-colonial elites who've already shown a tendency to perpetuate many of the very same injustices the cart driver knew under colonialism, and the newly urbanized poor who understandably feel betrayed by this state of affairs. So this series of events builds up to the cart driver's final monologue, which laments the rigors of life in the city, including its new blocks of modern high-density housing, and in a move that might surprise some outside observers, it sets up his final encomium of his home neighborhood, which Sambén takes care to situate in the Quartier Populaire, northeast of the Place de l'Obélisque, and which the cart driver takes care to compare favorably to village life, despite the poverty that prevails there. And it's worth noticing that the cart driver's commentary meshes with a certain anti-urban discourse that was quite common in the African literature of this period, from Sheikh Amadou Khan to Achebe to Ngugi, and across the continent, really. And one of the things that makes this film interesting is that we can already see Sambén in 1962 trying to thread a very delicate needle, recognizing the need for economic modernization, and the extent to which traditional cultural practices may be in conflict with those imperatives, while also asking important questions about how to carry out that modernization on African terms. And it is that very question, how to modernize on African terms, that Mambéty will take up in his La Petite Vendeuse de Soleil. And Mambéty's film is about a young girl on crutches who makes her way to the city, where she will hawk newspapers, putting her in that gray zone between the formal and informal economies. Now, our first view of city emphasizes the extreme poverty of her home, which is located in the peri-urban zone outside of the city, near the airport. It emphasizes the arduousness of the journey to the city center in what may be actually an homage to Borom-Sarret. And Mambéty takes care to emphasize various markers of economic development and modernity, including not just the airport, but also new housing constructions, and in one of Mambéty's favorite symbols, mass-produced consumer appliances. Now, the first part of the film focuses on Siri's struggles to break into the newspaper hawking racket, which leads her to spend a very tough day in competition with a group of predatory boys, until about halfway into the film, she gets what might be just a lucky break, but might also be a testament to her resilience. She finds a benefactor who not only buys all of her papers, but also gives her a handsome tip and praises her for her initiative. And this is the point where the message of the film really begins to crystallize, because what she does with this unexpected windfall is actually to give most of it away, first to her grandmother, which makes sense, and then to an assortment of anonymous beggars, fulfilling the Islamic duty of charity. And then in what I consider to be the key scene of the film, she throws an impromptu dance party for the friends she has made in her time selling papers. And this particular scene, which doesn't advance the plot, might at first seem like a gratuitous interlude in the film, something like a Bollywood item number. But I think it's actually a key to understanding Mambéty's message, because it reframes Siri's relation to the survival economics that had dominated her story up to this point. It's something like the griot scene in Borom-Sarret. Outside observers might be tempted to interpret this behavior as wastefulness, Siri squandering her windfall on inessentials. But Mambéty uses this scene to show Siri rising above the dog-eat-dog competitiveness of her newfound trade and putting her hard-earned surplus towards communal rather than selfish ends. And here is where I would locate Mambéty's response to the tradition and modernity question posed in Rouch and Mambéty. The key to overcoming the alienating aspects of modernity is not to retreat from the city or from the city center, but to do a better job of reintroducing fundamental African values into the city, including that Senegalese tradition of teranga, or hospitality and mutual aid, which had been promoted by President Senghor in the early days of independence. Unless this seemed like a forced interpretation, I would emphasize that this message is reinforced in the final scenes of the film, where the boys who have been tormenting Siri steal her crutches, leaving her in what is obviously an extremely vulnerable position. But rather than giving up, Siri expresses her determination to carry on and literally rides off into the sunset, now on the back of her faithful companion Babu, who has been teaching her the tricks of the news hawking trade. And this is a remarkable image that that gives new meaning to Abdul Malik Simon's notion of people as infrastructure. And the message seems to be that Siri, although physically and economically weak, has the social skills to forge the kind of strong community alliances that make survival possible in these harsh conditions. And this denouement is coupled with a number of images that suggest a clear allegorical message about the need for Senegal to wean itself off of dependence on Western-dominated institutions like the franc CFA, and to develop its capacity for self-reliance, no doubt in the tradition of le Lièvre. And if we keep in mind that this film was made in the years of structural adjustment, we might extend this allegorical advice to other dependencies, like the conditional loans of the IMF and the World Bank, which the economist Ha Jun Chang famously compared to the West kicking away the ladder of protectionist economic policies that had enabled the economic ascension of the colonial powers, but were now deemed unacceptable for developing economies in the era of neoliberal hegemony. So there's obviously a lot more to say on this topic and on the evolution of the tradition modernity motif over the years, but I'll have to save that for another time. Instead, I'd like to conclude very briefly by returning to the questions I asked at the beginning of this paper. What does it mean to talk about urban informality as a lieu de mémoire? What is being memorialized? And what does this teach us about post-colonial cities more generally? And one, no doubt, obvious lesson is that the object of memorialization here is not the geographical sites themselves, this or that particular bidonville or any particular person or historical event, but the collective efforts of the people who live there to transform alienating urban spaces into places that they can call home. In other words, what these films are really memorializing, I believe, is the social processes that Henri Lefebvre called the social production space, with an emphasis on the powerful forms of agency and the creative capacities of those who find themselves at the very bottom of the economic pyramid. And this emphasis on creative potential and agency is important because some Western commentators, like Mike Davis, in his influential book, Planet of Slums, have adopted a kind of tragic or apocalyptic perspective on urban informality, presenting the informal settlements of post-colonial cities in an undifferentiated way, grouping them all together as places of social death and absolute suffering, and describing their residents as completely deprived of agency and hope. But what the focus on urban informality as a lieu de mémoire has to do is to present a much more nuanced understanding of the topic, one that foregrounds the slum dweller's perspective. And it's this kind of work that urbanists like Abdul Malik Simon and Jennifer Robinson are doing, using ethnographically oriented studies of urban informality to think about the ways in which informal practices can be leveraged to make life better for those who currently live on the city's margins. And they emphasize the importance of treating urban informality as part of the ordinary functioning of cities. And they emphasize the need to work towards incremental solutions that can make a concrete difference in the lives of slum dwellers, rather than assuming that only a radical systemic overhaul of the world economy will bring about meaningful change, as abstractive thinkers like Mike Davis tend to do. To outsiders, and this is true of both foreign and domestic outsiders, informal settlements are often viewed simply as manifestations of political or economic dysfunction, blights on the landscape, not something to be devalued. In that sense, they might appear to be closer to non-lieu than to lieu de mémoire. But the kind of insider's perspective I've been discussing show that the internal dynamics of such places are much more complex and have much greater productive potential than is commonly recognized. And it's the lack of a widely accepted conceptual apparatus for understanding the modalities of social production in the informal context that makes this hidden productive potential so difficult to detect. And I would argue that this is precisely why the kinds of acts of memorialization that I've been talking about are so necessary. And I'll stop there. Thank you.